Hey everyone, this is the week 1 foundational principles primer video. So to start off, we're going to talk about the 3 planes of motion. So we have the sagittal plane, things moving forward into flexion or backwards into extension. We have the frontal plane, so adduction, things moving towards midline, or abduction, things moving away from midline. And then lastly, we have the transverse plane, which is external rotation, so turning out, and then internal rotation, turning in. We're going to also get into how actually every muscle action is triplanar because of the way that muscles are structured and how they contract. Then we're going to talk about inhalation and exhalation mechanics. So as I take a breath in, my diaphragm is going to flatten in my rib cage, my guts, viscera, things that don't have attachments are going to descend, and my pelvic floor is going to dome to catch those. As I take a breath out, my thoracic diaphragm or diaphragm in my rib cage is going to ascend, so this one's going to dome, come up. My pelvic diaphragm is also going to ascend, but it's going to be previously domed. It's going to flatten out as my pelvis changes shape, which I'll show you guys later on. Getting into relative motion versus absolute orientation. When we say absolute orientation, we're talking about things moving as entire units. So this would be something like an anterior pelvic tilt or a posterior pelvic tilt. Great example of a posterior pelvic tilt is when you see someone butt wink in a squat. When I say relative motion, I'm talking about these individual bones or other bones within the body being able to move on one another. So an example would be as my sacrum, this middle bone right here, tips forward, these innominate bones should relatively tip back. So an example would be if my sacrum tips forward into what is called nutation, which is going to be coupled with internal rotation, these innominate bones should tip back, internally rotate and adduct, and that should follow down the chain. So the femur would also internally rotate if that's what's happening here. It's going to go down to the tibia, which is going to internally rotate, and my foot would be in more of a pronated position. So we're going to talk about the hip flexion arc, which is what happens as you move through different amounts of hip flexion in an activity like a squat. So from 0 to 60 degrees, we're going to have our pelvis go into a shape that is more open and kind of like a flower. So this is going to tie into our relative motion discussion. So as I go from 0 to 60, my sacrum, this middle bone, right, is going to tip back towards me. These innominates are going to go relatively forward into flexion, abduction, and external rotation. And that's going to follow down the chain to the femur, the tibia, and the foot. So the foot would be in more of a supinated position. As I go into the mid-range of a squat, which is about 60 to 110, the sacrum is going to nutate, so it's going to tip forward towards you guys. These innominate bones are going to tip back, adduct, and internally rotate. And if I had this hip doing the exact same thing, this femur is going to follow into internal rotation down the chain into the tibia. I would have a more pronated foot. Last section, 110 plus. If I can squat ass to grass, as some people might know it as, my pelvis is going to open back up, so it's going to externally rotate, flex, and abduct at these innominates, and this sacrum is going to tip back towards me into that counter nutated position again. I hope this was helpful for you guys, and we can't wait to see you during the first presentation.